All right, welcome everyone. Great to see you all here. My name is Rory Titcomb, and I am the COO here at FFA, and I want to thank you all for being here with us. It's a real pleasure to see so many wonderful faces in the room. I'm joined by two other members of FFA's team, Amanda Eldridge and S. Famajour. If you two can wave. And this is, so Amanda's our VP of Business Development, and this is S's second week joining as our program manager. So give an extra warm welcome to her. Really excited to have the FFA team growing. While we kick off, I want to invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat and, drop your name, your company name, where you're dialing in from. And I'm in Seattle, and as you can see out my window, like summer has officially started, which is wonderful and really exciting. And that has brought about iced coffee, which is a welcome change, and dresses, which is also a welcome change after many, many months in pandemic attire. So please, if you feel inclined to share any of your kind of shifting season information in the chat, that would be great too. For those of you who are newer to FFA's community, we are a network of founders, partners, investors, and supporters, and we all collaborate to help women and non-binary founders and startup leaders succeed. We offer programming, community incubation, and investment opportunities, all with a mission to increase the number of successful founders 20 times over in 10 years or less. And these roundtables are one key part of that programming, where we bring in experts in specific areas to share their knowledge with the FFA community. And today we are joined by the incredible team from Burkland Associates, and they're going to talk to us about, one essential aspect of operating a SaaS business, which is, metrics and KPIs. And we're going to get to dig in on, what are the key metrics you should be measuring? How do you measure them? And how do you calculate them correctly, which is also critical. And then kind of how does that tie into the milestones that you're trying to hit as a business, and matching that to what investors or stakeholders may be expecting from you. Burkland provides fractional CFO services, bookkeeping and accounting and tax services. And they work with companies from, early stage, very early stage, all the way up to, Series C and beyond. And their goal really is to kind of help startups build systems that scale as they grow. And, they want to be kind of your partner in that growth journey. So our goal for this session is to have it be kind of as interactive as possible. I see lots of good comments in the chat coming in, so keep that live. Let's make it fun. And get your questions going in there. We have JP here from the Burkland team who will kind of help facilitate questions. And I've had the joy of kind of getting to know Debbie and JP, and they're open to making this a collaborative conversation. So now I want to introduce our speakers and reps from Burkland. So first, JP, can you give everybody a wave?
Nice to meet everybody. Thank you, Rory.
Nice to have you here, JP. JP does all of their ecosystem partnerships and works with accelerators in different communities. And I've had the real pleasure of getting to know him a little bit over the almost 6 months for a good part of the year. And we also have Debbie with us. Debbie, can you give us a wave?
Hi, everyone.
So Debbie is currently the CFO for 5 SaaS startups. She's got 20 plus years of finance leadership experience, and with companies that range in industry and size, from very early stage startups all the way to Fortune 500 companies. She's been with Burkland for 7 years, since 2014. And she focuses especially on SaaS companies. So we're really, really lucky to have her here to share her knowledge. And with that, Debbie, thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand the mic over to you and stop talking. I'm so excited to learn from you. Thank you for being with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rory, for the kind introduction, and really excited to be here today and talk with all of you. So to kick it off, just to quickly walk through the agenda. Um, for Here's the agenda for the meeting. I did receive some pre-meeting questions from people, so I'm going to do my best to cover that as we go through the session. If there's anything I missed at the end, there'll be time for Q&A, and so please ask at the end, and then also feel free to put questions in the chat as you go, and JP will make sure I know about the questions, and he'll let me know, and I'll answer them. The bulk of the presentation is going to be a discussion about what we consider to be the top 10 SaaS metrics. I'm also going to do a little bit of to talk around some B2B versus B2C SaaS metrics based on one of the questions I received, and also share some of the resources that we suggest as well. So just a quick introduction of Burkland. I think Rory hit a lot of the key points already, but just in general, Burkland provides outsourced finance and accounting support to venture-backed startups, companies that are usually between the seed up until the Series C stages. And the support includes fractional CFO support, which is the work that I do, as well as accounting, tax, and people operations. We have a team of 30 CFOs, and we work with over 400 startups throughout the US. And we work with startups across all industries, but we have specialized practices specifically in SaaS, fintech, consumer, and healthcare. And as Rory mentioned, my focus is in SaaS. I am currently a fractional CFO for 5 different SaaS companies. So SaaS metrics is definitely something that's very near and dear to my heart, and I spend a lot of time working on that with my clients. So to kick it off, SaaS metrics overload. So just first for some context, there's some financial metrics that most companies look at, such as revenue, cash, operating income. And these standard financial metrics are governed by GAAP, also known as generally accepted accounting principles. And that's authoritative standards that are set by central policy boards. However, while these are important metrics, in order to truly understand SaaS companies, you need to go a little deeper and go beyond GAAP measures and dive into SaaS metrics. And these metrics underscore one of the most compelling aspects of the SaaS business model, which is the recurring revenue nature of subscription business. And the metrics, the SaaS metrics also highlight how effective companies are at closing, growing, and retaining these subscription revenues. One thing that's important to note about these SaaS metrics is that they're not regulated or even commonly defined. So whereas GAAP measures, it's very standard and defined what revenue is. A lot of the SaaS metrics, it's sort of a little bit left up to you to figure out exactly how you're going to define it for your company. And not only is it hard to sort of sometimes define what the metrics are, what you're seeing is a significant proliferation of SaaS metrics. It seems that every self-proclaimed SaaS expert wants to design and popularize their own metric. So some of these metrics are really great, but many of them can be redundant or duplicative to other metrics that are out there. And so thus this sort of slide that sort of shows someone really overwhelmed with all the different metrics and, how do you figure out where to start? I myself, as I was working on this presentation, just sort of looking around the internet just to get some sort of insights and inputs. And frankly, it's very overwhelming. There's so much out there, a lot of great content, some okay content. So what I did is I put together some of my favorite resources on the right side of this slide, ones that I'll reference throughout this presentation. We're going to send a copy of this presentation to everyone afterwards, and all of these the sites are linked, so you'll be able to have links into the content that I'm suggesting that you take a look at. And overall, my goal today is to basically help you navigate through this information overload of SaaS metrics and sort of try to figure out sort of what's a good starting point, what are some of the key essential metrics that you should be looking at. So to start, Burkland has identified what we view as the top 10 most important SaaS metrics. And I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive on each of these metrics during our discussion. On this slide, I've grouped the metrics by stage applicability. So I've divided it into 3 stages: launch, optimize, expand. that roughly translates into sort of venture funding stages of seed, Series A, Series B, generally speaking. And basically the way to think about it is at the launch stage, you don't have a lot of history. You're just getting out there, you're starting to make sales, but you don't really have an understanding of, what the churn patterns are for your business, how long the customer's lifetime is going to be. So it's really the metrics at that early stage are more focused on, did you generate the revenue? Are you selling the contracts? And so the focus there is around ARR growth. What's the average contract value, gross margin? That's sort of the only kind of data you have early on. And then as you evolve further, you bring in some of these other metrics as you get a better understanding of a repeatable and scalable business model, and understand, how long you're retaining customers, how you're growing them over time. That gets into some of the metrics around churn and retention and payback period, and how much money it takes to acquire some of the revenues. And then as you get to even later stage and you really sort of you're getting to the point that you really understand the repeatable model and you're really working on scaling the business, that's when you get into sort of the LTV to CAC metric, which is a metric that's talked about a lot, and a lot of people sort of try to pull it in at an earlier stage, but frankly, the data is sort of better. Once you have enough data, it's a better metric to look at a little bit later in the stage. I do want to call out that while I'm highlighting these top 10 metrics, many companies also have their own unique KPIs that are foundational to their business performance. And it's highly dependent on the unique value proposition. So while I'd say sort of all SaaS companies should be looking at these metrics as a starting point, many companies are going to come up with their own metrics that are really critical and foundational. So, just some examples of that is Twilio in their early years focused on the number of messages sent. DocuSign tracked the number of signed envelopes. So whatever's relevant to your business model, obviously you'll want to be looking at those metrics in addition to these SaaS metrics. Okay. So to kick it off, ARR, so the foundational SaaS metric. ARR, or annual recurring revenue, it's a key metric used by SaaS or subscription businesses to measure the annual run rate of recurring revenue from the current installed base of customers. ARR, unlike revenue is a measure over a period of time. So how much revenue did you earn? ARR is a point in time measure that represents the annual run rate you have for the next 12 months as of today, or as of the date of measurement, assuming no additional business is added or churned. And ARR should only include the contractually committed portion of subscription fees. So it doesn't include one-time fees. So a lot of subscription companies will have sort of an annual subscription fee, and then maybe at the time of implementation, they'll have an extra sort of implementation fee. That implementation fee should not be included as part of ARR. Some companies also, or may instead look at MRR, or monthly recurring revenue. It's essentially the same thing as ARR, but expressed on a monthly basis. Sometimes companies think of it that if you have a larger proportion of your contracts that are based on annual renewals, you'll look at ARR. If you have a larger proportion focused on monthly renewals, you'll look at MRR. Frankly, for me, I just find ARR to be an easier concept, because if I'm looking at MRR, I'm having to, in my head, multiply by 12, which isn't always that easy. So I just like to look at the annual level. One thing about ARR, so like I mentioned on the last slide, there's not a consistent set of definitions for a lot of these metrics. And so what's important is that within your company, you have internal consistency. So you want to make sure that you have a standard definition of what should be included in ARR. And some examples of where you can sort of fall off is sort of, what's the point at which you count ARR? Do you count it at the point that you sign a contract? Do you count it at the point that you implement or launch the business? And, and for some companies, particularly enterprise companies, there can be a significant lag between when you sign a contract versus when it goes live. And that could be because of implementation timelines. Other companies have multi-year contracts that maybe have phases where they're phasing in the launch over time, and it's going over time, so that while they'll have maybe, $200,000 of contracted annual revenue, maybe 50,000 phases in the first year, another 100,000 in the second year, and so on. And so the question is, how do you define what you consider ARR? For some of the companies that have these big distinctions between contract timing and launch, what I often do is I'll actually have two separate ARR metrics. one for contracted ARR, and then another for live ARR. But those are some of the pitfalls and the definitions you need to be really careful about. Another example that I've come across is when do you consider an account is churned? So some annual contracts, when they come up on renewal, maybe you haven't officially signed the renewal, but you're in negotiations, and maybe it's just going to take another week or two. So do you consider it churned at the point of contract renewal if it's not renewed, or do you give yourself some leeway? What are the rules around that? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of you need to have sort of a standard set, and your rules may not be 100% consistent with other companies, and that's why sometimes comparing across companies and benchmarking isn't perfect, but the most important thing is to be internally consistent yourself and to be very clear on what the rules are. Okay, so next metric I'm going to talk about is annual contract value. That's the average annual contract value of a customer subscription, often measured at the time that you sign the contract. And the size of a company's ACV is often directly related to its selling strategy. So companies with lower average contract values often have to rely on a lower touch, marketing-driven sales generation process, whereas companies with really high ACVs, enterprise-type companies, will often have a higher touch enterprise sales team. So something to think about there. So the next metric is ARR growth. And the key thing about ARR growth, you want to look at that as sort of a percent growth over time. You can look at it monthly, you can look at it year over year, but just sort of it's a percent growth. But the important thing about looking at growth is that you want to make sure from a SaaS perspective that you're breaking it out into its key components in terms of what's driving the growth. And the components you want to break growth out, and you want to look at this at least on a monthly basis, is you want to basically, the chart on this page shows what's called the momentum ARR growth. And basically at the beginning of each month, you look at what's the starting ARR, and then you look at the 4 components that are driving increases and decreases in the ARR during the course of the month. The first component is new ARR, and that's basically any newly signed customers from that month. How much additional ARR did you generate from them? The next component is expansion ARR. So any customers that you had on board at the beginning of the month, but you expanded, you grew, what's the additional ARR you generated from that company during the course of that month? And that expansion can be driven by a variety of factors. It could be price increases, product upgrades, increase in user accounts, anything that's going to increase the revenues from that existing customer. The corollary of expansion ARR is contraction, and that's basically a decrease in the size of a customer, but it's contracting, not being lost. So if that customer has a product downgrade or anything that would bring the revenues down over the course of the month, that would be measured as a contraction. And then the last measure would be churned ARR, and that would be the ARR lost from customers that you had at the beginning of the month that are no longer customers at the end of the month. And part of why it's really important to measure these different ARR components is it tells a lot about the business model. So if you look at, a lot of enterprise companies are focused on a land and expand model. And so what you'd expect to see with them is that you'll have a very large proportion of their growth over time driven by expansion. So maybe they'll land and start with sort of initially small revenues, but then be expanding over time. And so their expansion revenues represent a really large portion of the revenue growth. Some other smaller companies, SMB companies that maybe are land companies and you're not really expanding as much over time, the bulk of the growth is going to be coming just from the new ARR and not as much the expansion. Another sort of key metric that tells a lot of insights about the business is the churn ARR. So how much of the business are you losing over time? That gives you insights to the lifetime of the customer. So are the customers staying on board for a really long time, or are they churning quickly over time? So that's some of the key components of ARR growth.
And
now,
Debbie,
yes.
Sorry to take you off track here. Looks like we had a question in the chat around ACV and how to think about discounting, and how to factor that into that ACV calculation. It'd be great if you could touch on that for the audience.
Discounting in terms of pricing or discounting?
So looks like the question, we often see discounting as a strategy to onboard customers, and wondering just how we'd factor that into just the ACV.
Yeah, so basically if you offer a discount, say for the first year, your ARR and your average contract value should be based on the discount. So you don't, even if a year from now the price is going to go up, or expected to upon renewal, you should be counting what you're actually officially contracted for at this point. Now, having said that, if you give someone a discount, but they're locked into, let's say, a 2-year contract, so you know that, let's say the first year is 50,000, the second year is 100,000, and if you have this sort of concept of separation between contracted ARR versus live ARR, you may consider the larger number as what's contracted, because ultimately you're going to get to that higher point. But in terms of what's actually live, which you're actually able to recognize revenue based on, it's the lower number. So that's really what I would use to count both the ACV and at least the live ARR metric. So, okay. So in terms of benchmarks on ARR growth, and throughout the presentation, I'm going to try to give benchmarks on some of the metrics. So this slide highlights, what's considered sort of some of the good, better, best levels of ARR growth. And this is the frame of reference here is sort of venture-backed startups. So Bessemer Ventures, which is one of the top most prestigious investors in SaaS companies, came up with sort of a guidelines for what they would consider to be good, better, best growth. And again, the frame of reference here is these are companies that Bessemer is backing. So that's really the cream of the crop, the top SaaS companies. And in their view, they talked about this in their State of the Cloud presentation that they recently gave. And what they say is, in terms of a good level of growth is basically a company that's able to go from 1 million ARR to 100 million ARR within 12 years. Better is to do that in 7 years, and best is to do that within 6 years. And this sort of closely aligns with what's sort of been out there for a while, known as the T2D3 benchmark. And what that is it suggests that after a company reaches 1 million in ARR, what should the growth be after that for the next several years? And basically T2D3 basically stands for triple, triple, double, double, double. So the idea is after you reach 1 million of revenue, the next year, a great goal is to triple, and then to triple again, and then to double and double and double. And basically what that means is by 5 years out, after you've reached the 1 million ARR point, you get to 72 million. And you can sort of easily see how that threshold would get you to 100 million within 6 years, sort of similar to the Bessemer benchmark also. So that would sort of be considered sort of cream of the crop, best in class growth rates. Now, what I'll have to say is that while this is sort of, a North Star vision that you want to get to if you want to be sort of able to be backed by one of the top tier venture firms, keep in mind that most SaaS companies do not achieve this level of growth. And so if you look at benchmarks, and I had one of the links I provided at the beginning was a really great benchmarking survey that's put out by KeyBank Capital Markets every year. And their SaaS survey, if you find their growth rates, it's definitely going to be much lower than some of these averages that would be implied by these goals. But again, it sort of gives you a framework for what you would need to get to if you want to be able to be backed by a Bessemer or one of the top tier venture firms. So any questions about that? Okay, so going into our next metric, gross margin. So gross margin is basically gross profit divided by revenue. So it's expressed as a percent. Gross profit for SaaS companies is calculated as revenue less direct cost of sales. And those direct costs of sales are commonly referred to as COGS. And COGS, what you need to include in the COGS would be any expense that's directly associated with service delivery. So there's 4 key categories for a SaaS company of what you would include in the COGS. The first is hosting and infrastructure. So for many companies, they use outsourced providers like Azure or Amazon Web Service or Google Cloud. What you want to make sure in terms of the hosting costs and what you include is you only want to include the costs that are actually being used to serve the customers. So in many cases, companies also are doing R&D on their own platforms internally, and they're using hosting costs for that. And so ideally what you want to be doing is separating out, and you want to include only the cost to serve customers and the cost of goods sold. And then the part for R&D goes sort of below the line into operating expenses. Another expense that goes into the direct cost is customer support. So that's the on-demand support for offering technical assistance. for the software product. So customers calling in and saying, I'm trying to get set up, my password doesn't work, that type of thing. It's not about customer success. So it's not about trying to drive renewals, increase customer engagement, drive expansions. In many cases, companies will have a customer success team that is a hybrid between providing customer support and then also what's considered more sort of customer success, which is more associated with trying to grow the business. And if you're in that situation, what you need to do is you have to figure out sort of an allocation of what portion of those costs are associated with the support side versus more the sort of upsell side, and then separate those out so that only the support side goes into cost of sales. A lot of the times what I do with companies is we sort of come up with a high level allocation assumption. Maybe it's 50-50% breakout between the two of how it splits. But you'll know what your team does and come up with a methodology for that. The next sort of key category of costs is cloud operations and platform support. And this is internal teams that would help maintain the operational efficiency of hosted software. So if you have cybersecurity experts that are managing the cloud operation security or something along those lines. And then the last category of cost is third-party fees. So this could be transactional expenses, Square or Stripe fees. It could be if you're using third-party software to deliver to your customer, the cost for that. Anything along those lines would fit into that categories. But that's sort of what drives into the gross profit. And then overall, once you look at that on a benchmark basis, what you see is that SaaS gross margins are actually quite high. It's best in class to try to target a gross margin 80% or higher. According to the KBCM SaaS survey, the average was 78% for subscription margin, and then a total gross margin of 73%. Now, the difference between subscription margin and total gross margin is that subscription is only associated with the annual recurring revenues, whereas total could include some other business lines. So a lot of SaaS companies will have a professional services arm that charges, that's helping to do implementations or upgrades, that type of a thing. And so that'll be often a lower margin business. And that's why overall margins for some SaaS companies can be dragged down. Now, also another question that was pre-asked in before the session, someone asked about how to think about KPIs if your company also has hardware. And so if your SaaS offering also involves hardware, the cost of the hardware also would need to be included in the cost of goods sold. And that would inherently also drag down the SaaS margins as well. One thing I'd call out there is that if that hardware, you shouldn't recognize that hardware expense in the period it's purchased. You should recognize that hardware expense over the useful life. So basically, you don't want to drag down your margin too much by sort of an initial hardware purchase. If you're buying hardware that's going to be lasting for 3 years, you want to spread that cost over a period of time. Okay. So next metric, we're going to talk. Any questions about gross margin before I go on, actually? Okay, so next metric we're going to talk about is customer churn, and that's based on the number of customers that you've lost in a period of time. Now, in the previous metric when I talked about the components of growth, I was looking at churn, but I was talking about churn dollars. When you're talking about customer churn, the metric there is actually number of accounts. So how many accounts, how long does it take to, what's the percent of customers that you're losing in a given month? And so or in a given period. And so if you look at the table on this page, you can see sort of, you're looking at sort of what customers did you have at the beginning of the year, how many did you add, how many did you lose? And then the number of lost customers divided by the customers at the beginning of the period. And in this example, I'm looking at it on an annual basis. In this case, it's 10%. So it's basically saying, over the course of a year, on average, you lost about 10% of your customers. Now, in terms of benchmarks, this is a little harder because the churn rates can actually vary quite a bit based on your business model. Bessemer Ventures, a sort of a guideline that they've thrown out there is that they like to see companies with churn rates under 7%. But that sort of can apply to enterprise companies. A lot of SMB or B2C companies might have a much higher churn rate. But again, the corollary to that is that they may also have lower cost of acquisition. So they keep their customer maybe a shorter period of time, but maybe it costs less to acquire them in the first place. But you may see SMB companies having churn rates, more in the 20% range. Think about churn. If you think about sort of the lifetime of a company, if you look at a monthly churn rate, if you look at the inverse of that, 1 divided by the monthly churn rate is equivalent to the number of months lifetime on average. So when you think about the lifetime months, if you have a 20% annual churn rate, that means basically every 5 years you're turning over your customers on average. And then there's also separate averages from the KBCM SaaS survey in terms of what you see in terms of churn rates. And again, there, the top quartile is in that range that Bessemer says that you want to be targeting. Okay, so next metric we're going to talk about is net dollar retention. And so net dollar retention, it's calculated as the ARR in the period for a set of customers at the end of the period versus that's what it was for that same set of customers at the beginning of the period. So if you look at the graph I have laid out on this page, at the beginning of the period, the company had 4 different customers, each with 100 ARR. And then at the end of the period, in period 2, one of the customers has been lost. You're at 3 customers. A couple of them have expanded. One has declined. But overall, the ARR goes from 400 up to 500. So the net dollar retention is calculated as 500 divided by 400, or 125%. And so basically what that means is over the period of time for the same group of customers, if your net retention is greater than 100%, it means that overall the upsells, expansions of those customers is greater than what the churn was. If it's, the alternative is if it's less than 100%, it means that the churn is greater than any benefits you're getting from upsells and expansions from those existing customers. The median that you see in the KBCM survey was 103%. As a general rule, what you like to see is that higher ACV products have a higher net retention rate. That's what you'd expect to see. And the corollary to that is that it's more expensive to acquire these higher ACV products. So you have a sort of a full sales team going out and trying to acquire it. So you want to see sort of more retention over time as well. Some rule of thumbs is that maybe if you're selling into SMBs, those companies do have the higher churn and maybe not as much in the way of upsells. So maybe a good net retention rate would be sort of 90% or above. Whereas enterprise getting to the 125+% is a good threshold that you want to sort of try to achieve. So any questions on this? Okay. So the next 2 metrics I'm going to talk about are capital consumption and cash efficiency. They're actually very interrelated. Capital consumption really is the lifeblood of a SaaS business, and both of these 2 metrics are measures that look at how much ARR is generated based on cash that the company is using. The 2 metrics are very similar, but one measures cumulative lifetime capital usage relative to ARR growth, and the other measures it over a point in time. So the capital consumption ratio, that's basically calculated as total invested capital to date minus cash. So it's basically the cash that the company has used on a cumulative basis since inception divided by the total ARR. So how many dollars did you need to spend to get all the ARR that you've generated over time? And as a general rule, lower is better. Best in class is seen to be under 1. The median from the KBCM survey is 1.3 times. Their top quartile is under 0.6. So just as a threshold. Now the cash efficiency ratio, sort of officially the way it's calculated, it's actually the inverse. So it's sort of flipped on its end, but it's basically during a period of time, what's the ARR growth divided by the change in cash during that same period of time. And so in the same way, so whereas capital consumption, you want it to be less than 1, cash efficiency, you want to see it be greater than 1. And what I find is that I'll often use cash efficiency like on an ongoing basis. It's particularly useful for companies that may have had a hiccup in the early years. So maybe they were slow to get going. And so their initial sort of leverage and sort of getting, building up, getting the ARR built might take time, but then they sort of hit their stride. And so you don't want to necessarily always be dinged by the sort of since inception metric, but you want to be looking at how you're doing it on more of an ongoing basis. Any questions about this? Okay. Okay, so next slide is about CAC payback period. So overall, CAC means customer acquisition cost, and it's the cost to acquire a single customer. And the CAC payback period is calculated as the number of months it takes for a customer's gross margin to cumulatively pay back the customer acquisition costs. And customer lifetime value is calculated as the undiscounted total gross margin expected from a customer from the beginning, from when you initially sign them up until the time that they're expected on average to churn. And I think this graph is really helpful to sort of understand visually sort of the interplay between CAC and lifetime value. The black horizontal line represents time, and the vertical line represents cumulative profit. So if you look at sort of at the very left, the CAC number on the very left, the most negative number is basically that's the total cost you spent to acquire that customer. So you'd probably look at that, you calculate that based on the sales and marketing costs in a given period divided by the total number of new accounts that you acquired during that period, and that would be considered the customer acquisition cost for that account. And then basically, as you go to the right, what you can see is there's sort of a straight line that shows, over time you're adding profits. You're adding profits, and you go from sort of negative to the point that you get to the line where the CAC payback line, which basically you recouped all of the costs of acquisition via the profits you're generating over time. And then because you're still retaining that customer even after the CAC payback period, you go into the green and start generating profits. Now the sort of the solid line that you're seeing, that's basically assuming that the customer has sort of steady profits on a monthly periodic basis. But in reality, a lot of companies do have more of a land and expand type of a view. So instead of keeping a straight line in terms of that green bar, you might actually start varying up a little bit, where you're getting benefits from pricing, upsell, cross-sell, and the like. And so actually the value of the profits can sort of grow on more of an exponential basis over time. And then basically at the very end is the point at which the customer churns, and that's the end, that's the lifetime value, the cumulative lifetime value that you've generated from the customer. So any questions about that?
Debbie, it looks like we do have one in the chat from Emily. The question states, for early stage startups, we often don't know LTV. How do you do CAC without knowing LTV? Or do you just guess LTV?
So as I mentioned on the first slide, when talking about sort of the right timing to look at LTV to CAC, LTV is a tricky measure at the early stage. And one of the reasons it's really tricky is that at the earliest stage, you don't really have experience training customers. So you don't really have an idea of how long you'll be able to retain customers over time. So it's really guesswork at that stage. As such, my recommendation is that this LTV to CAC metric is really something that's more appropriate at a later stage when you have more data and are able to actually do the analysis. Now, having said that, even though it's really not a great metric at the early stage, sometimes you'll see that investors are still asking about it really early on. And it's frustrating because it's difficult because the reality is you don't have the data to do it. But what I suggest is at that early stage, LTV to CAC isn't so much based on actual experience, but it's more based on your financial modeling, sort of how you're growing the business and what you're expecting to achieve over time. So a big part of your, when you're building your first long range financial model is building out the revenue model, understanding these unit economics and sort of how you expect it to grow over time. And so you'll have some assumptions around what you believe that's going to be. Now, when you're talking to investors, you can share what the assumptions are and what your justification for it is, but you're not actually going to be able to prove out whether you're able to achieve that until a little later on. But it is helpful to really have a good sense of sort of, because we believe that we'll be able to retain this customer for X number of years, and we believe that the profits will grow this, we can justify spending this much money on sales and marketing and acquiring the customer. And understanding that can help you sort of figure out the appropriate selling model and how much high touch you put into it versus trying to make it be a low touch sales process. Now, in terms of customer acquisition cost, that's something that you can actually determine from the beginning, really. And what that would represent is sales and marketing costs divided by the number of acquired customers. What I can say, though, is that the very, very earliest stages, it can be a little challenging to figure that out, because at the very, very beginning, when you're just starting up with a CEO, you probably don't even have a sales team, or you may have one salesperson, but a lot of the actual sort of sales and marketing costs can be coming from the executive team, from the CEO, from the CTO, others who are not really salespeople, but are involved in sales efforts at the very beginning. And so in that context of the very early stage, if you wanted to figure out customer acquisition costs, it's tricky. And technically, if you did want to do it, you would probably need to try to figure out a way to allocate the CEO's, the CTO's time spent on selling into that to figure it out. And then basically what you would look at as you would do your best to sort of capture those sales and marketing costs, and then divide it by the number of new accounts that you acquired during that period. And that would be the average customer acquisition cost. I often find that at that earliest stage, I don't really focus too much on that metric early on. I start looking at CAC a little bit later, once you have a little better data and understanding of sort of the sales motion and what that's going to look like on a more scalable, repeatable process basis. So in terms of some of the metrics around CAC payback, so David Scott, who's sort of the god of SaaS metrics in my view, he has great content. But several years ago, he had put out this sort of threshold that you want to target 12 months CAC payback. And that was put out, I mean, probably 10 years ago, that was a rule of thumb that was put out there. And I think what we've seen over time is that holds for certain businesses, but not all. So if you're a small, medium business, selling into the small, medium business space, and you don't have a ton of expansion over time, and maybe have a higher churn, it applies there, that you want to get CAC payback within 12 months. But if you're an enterprise company, you might spend a lot of money acquiring the customer. You may start with a relatively small business, maybe even a pilot or something, but then that expansion opportunity over time is really significant. It might take several years to get that expansion, and you might be able to retain that customer for 10 years or more. And so what happens is the payback may come a lot slower with enterprise companies. And so that sort of rule of thumb of 12 years applies to certain companies, but really not to all. So you got to be really sometimes careful when you apply some of these benchmarks and figure out what's really most relevant to your company. Was there a question, JP?
Yeah, Debbie, it'd be awesome. We got one from Rory. Could you expand on just what goes into CAC, and if that's just only dollars spent, or how founders can think about what goes into the CAC metric?
Yeah, so actually this slide talks a little bit about some of the sales and marketing costs, but what you see in it is it would be the people related costs. So like I said, it would be the sales team, the marketing team. At the earliest stage, you might include an allocation of some of the executives as well. And it would also be marketing spend, so advertising spend, anything outward facing. Technically, it should be, if you have a department level P&L, it should be any of the expenses associated with sales and marketing. So it could get into software expenses associated with those teams, travel, everything else. Sometimes it's complicated to do that, and those other expenses are not that material. So I don't get hung up on, tearing it apart too much, but the bulk of those costs really are the people related costs, and then the advertising spend is typically the core part of the CAC. And then customer acquisition cost, it does represent sort of a cost per customer acquired. So you're looking at those total sales and marketing costs and dividing it by the number of new customers signed in a given period, and that's the CAC per customer. Lifetime value on the corollary, that's calculated as the average revenue you're getting by a given customer each period, each month, multiplied by a gross margin, or taking out the cost to serve that. So that's the gross margin, and then adding that cumulative gross margin over the course of the lifetime. The thing that gets complicated with calculating lifetime value is it's a lot easier if you're if you're a B2B or SMB company that you have sort of a single, monthly price, and that price stays consistent over time, and you're likely to stay for 4 or 5 years, and you can pretty easily figure out the math. But what gets more complicated is when you get into a land and expand company, business where you have enterprise customers, and that grows over time. And maybe that growth isn't always consistent. And so how do you think about how to value the lifetime value, when you come in small and then you're growing over time? And that's part of the reason that I tend to recommend this whole LTV to CAC ratio as being something later on, is that it's a little hard to get a handle on LTV at the early stages. There are some really good, my favorite source of methodologies for calculating lifetime value is definitely David Scott, and I've linked here. There's a sort of a detailed definitions that he actually has some formulas for how to think about it for companies that are land and expand. For basic companies like an SMB or B2C where it's sort of consistent, very, very straightforward. But for any company that has land and expand, you can often have to get into some much more complicated modeling to think about that. And I think David Scott does a great job at sort of outlining how to do that. The rule of thumb that's been sort of shared out there is again, this is a long time David Scott metric that was thrown out there 10 years ago, saying that you want LTV to CAC to be 3 times or higher, and that's really a metric that's held for a long time. And I think it's actually fairly valuable across the range of SaaS model types. But again, the ability to actually truly measure that really comes in a little bit at a later stage. Any questions on that? Okay. So wrapping it up, we've gone through all of the 10 SaaS metrics we just discussed. One of the things, there was a pre-question that was sent to me by someone asking about, which of these metrics, like when you think about SaaS metrics, what do you look at daily, monthly, quarterly, annually? And I thought I'd just quickly sort of talk about that. In terms of daily metrics, I see companies tracking their ARR and customer churn on a sort of ongoing daily basis. So they'll have databases, metrics that they're able to sort of constantly see what their ARR is at. So that would be sort of what I'd consider a daily metric. Everything else would be monthly or monthly or less frequent. Capital consumption is a cumulative metric. So I think of that as more periodic, maybe looking at annually, possibly more frequently. Net dollar retention, that's one that's often looked at sort of year over year, although sometimes quarterly can make sense. And it also can make sense to look at it on a trailing 12-month basis. So even though you're looking at it over a 12-month period, each month you're looking at sort of how it shifts on a cumulative basis. LTV to CAC, like I said, that's one that you might hold off on measuring regularly, but once you're at scale, I do often view that actually on a monthly basis. But again, that's one that you want to look at on a blended trailing 12-month basis, because what you'll see is there'll be sort of month-to-month anomalies in churn. That one month you might have a really big churn, and if you're only looking at a single month, it'll really exacerbate and tank the LTV. Whereas if you're looking at it on a trailing 12-month basis, it'll sort of blend some of the monthly variations and anomalies. And all the other metrics in general, I'd say can be generally reviewed on a monthly basis, is what I would say. So another pre-question I received was about how do you think about B2B versus B2C SaaS metrics? And what I'd say overall is that those top 10 metrics apply to both B2B and B2C. As I discussed in there, sometimes the benchmarks of what you're trying to achieve may be different, but sort of the metrics and how they're calculated are fairly consistent. However, one thing that does differ between B2B and B2C is the sales funnel. And actually, I say B2B to B2C, but actually I'd say the distinction is more about often like a self-serve sales channel versus like an outbound enterprise-driven sales channel. So the self-serve, that would apply to B2C. It also often apply to SMB companies. But the idea is in general, sort of what are some of the key revenue drivers and the KPIs associated with that funnel. So on the B2C or self-serve side, you're going to want to be looking at metrics such as your ROI on ad spending in terms of signups and what the conversion rate is to signups on the website. So maybe you sign up initially for a freemium, and then what's the conversion rate to actually sign up first on the website and then sign up and become a paying customers. And then on the enterprise side, you might be looking at, enterprise reps might have a quota, but are they achieving their quota? So what's the sales that is being generated by a given enterprise rep might be a metric that would be important to look at. Okay. So just to quickly walk you through some of the other resources that I'd suggest, and we'll send this presentation out and there's links here, but we have a pretty extensive toolkit on about SaaS startups on the Burkland website. So I provide a link to that there. There's specifically a spreadsheet on SaaS metrics tracking. A question I had gotten in advance was like how to think about investor reporting. I think that SaaS metrics tracking spreadsheet is actually a pretty good starting point. When it comes to investor presentations, though, you're probably going to want to maybe take it up a level and do more of like graphical views. Definitely also if you're doing like board presentations and looking at some of these metrics, it can be helpful if you have a financial plan to look at sort of what your performance was against what you had expected, your plan was expected to be on some of these metrics. I also have, there's also a really great template on the website, which shows like sort of how to compare, especially like if you're doing long range planning, looking at some of those key metrics and then comparing it against the benchmarks and showing what you're planning for the business against the benchmarks. And you'll see the link to that. It actually pulls in some of the KBCM benchmarks and you're able to sort of see side by side how you're doing. So that's, I think, a pretty good template for investors as well. Another pre-question I'd gotten prior was around SaaS pricing. I didn't have time to cover that in this conversation because we had a lot to cover with the 10 SaaS metrics, but there's a really, really great article about the 10 key SaaS pricing model that I've linked here. It's also linked on the SaaS Toolkit website. So please take a look at that. And then one final resource I want to mention also is that any of the participants today, if you have further questions that you want to discuss about this or other finance and accounting topics, we'd be happy to share a complimentary consultation with you about finance or accounting topics. And please contact JP, and here's his contact information if you're interested in that. And with that, let's move into Q&A if there's any other questions in the chat or anything else people have questions about. Oh, actually, I did. There was one other additional, before I go there, actually, there was one additional pre-question that I wasn't able to cover in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read that question and let you guys know. One of the questions I received was do large corporate customers, what do large corporate customers look for most in terms of metrics from startup SaaS providers in terms of operational metrics? And I'll be the first to say that's not really my area of expertise. It's really sort of more seen at the sort of technology and sales levels where that's being explored. But I did reach out to one of my CEO clients to get input on this, so I thought I'd share that here. And what the CEO said was, he said he'd say that there was clearly a focus on stability, longevity for the companies. So will you continue to be in business? And they want to make sure that their bet's going to pay off. So if they're going to invest in a new software system, they want to make sure you're not going out of business coming up. They also care about uptime and response time and security. So do startups have the certifications needed? So if they're in healthcare, do they have HIPAA certification, GDPR, SOC2? Do they have 24/7 support? Is there an SLA? So these are all things that they sort of look at for startups to make sure that there's sort of a real there and that they want to work with the companies. So with that, I think we have a few more minutes, and if there's any additional questions, I'd be happy to run through that.
Awesome. Thanks, Debbie. It looks like we have a couple in the chat. I'm happy to read them off unless you're able to pull up the chat. Sounds like you maybe touched on this in the resources we have available, but could they find any templates for some of those metrics and the calculations that are in those resources, or do you have any templates that we could point the founders to?
Yeah, so in terms of templates, so the one that I had referenced here, the SaaS metrics tracking, that actually has a spreadsheet that actually calculates the SaaS metrics, so it shows the definitions. And also in this presentation, and I didn't go through this, but there actually is an appendix to this presentation that has definitions and formulas for all the metrics, and actually a few others that we didn't even cover are in here. Awesome. So I think that's sort of a good source for that.
Awesome. And then the next question I see is, what is the most common mistake you see that is hard to fix?
know if I'd say it's hard to fix, but I'd say it's common to not have. So I said at the very beginning that, SaaS metrics are not officially defined by a standard governing board. And so what I do see commonly is sort of a lack of definition, and sort of early on, maybe being a little looser in terms of what's defined, for example, as ARR. So, I'm dealing with this with one of my clients now, that we're seeing that, as an example, like they signed a contract with a client, but then that client, and this was sort of in the COVID timeframe, so all bets were off for a period of time. But they signed with the client, but the client never went live, and they invoiced the client never paid. So basically, they counted, because of their process had been to count ARR based on contracted revenue, but then it didn't actually go live. So it probably needed to be a churn, but we never churned it because there was always the expectation that it would eventually go live. So like it's what I see sort of early on is sort of these definitional errors where you're not maybe coming up with the really consistent approaches early on. And part of it is those definitions are somewhat dependent on the nature of the company and what you're experiencing. So you sometimes have to go through it to sort of be able to circle back and firm up what the rules should be. So I see that. I don't know if it's a mistake or a refinement, but I see that quite commonly, that it takes a while to sort of understand what the revenue model really looks like and be able to define what the metrics should be.
Awesome. And I think in the interest of time, Debbie, I see one question that's kind of standing out that I think might be really helpful for everybody to get a sense of what your thoughts are on this. I see one about, are there any metrics that companies like to use but actually are not that helpful? An example, vanity metrics.
Yeah, I mean, I think often, like I kept sort of warning against the LTV to CAC. I would say that would be one of them. A lot of times is that you're calculating an LTV based on unknown lifetimes, and so often maybe you're a company that hasn't had any churn yet, so you're saying, okay, we have a 10-year lifetime, or something ridiculous, and all of a sudden you come up with this 10 times LTV to CAC. Well, it's not meaningful. So yeah, it might look good in an investor presentation, but everyone's going to know to discount that. It's, and once investors sort of start digging into the, and any investor that cares about the metrics is also going to care about the definition. It's going to dig into it, and we'll see sort of what goes into it. So just know you're not fooling anyone if you start showing inflated, metrics without really any there. So. Okay. And so like I mentioned, in terms of resources, we do have, JP's contact information is on this presentation. Please reach out to him if you have additional questions, if we haven't covered anything else, and we'd be happy to set up a consultation and go through, anything that's really specific to your company or anything we didn't cover that you would like to talk about in more depth. Happy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, JP. Round of applause. I saw a lot of note-taking and very thoughtful faces in that. And so I appreciate kind of all the prep work that you did. We send these questions, we really do listen to those of you when you register, what do you really want to know? And it's amazing to see how well you customize this presentation to the audience. So thank you so much for that. It makes a really big difference. And I think that this final set of resources is super, super helpful. And as we mentioned in the chat and at the beginning, we'll be sending the slides out over email, and we'll also include JP's contact information in that, so that I've had the chance to actually connect with JP and some of their resources, and I think that they're a really, really phenomenal resource. So I hope that you all take them up on the opportunity to talk and learn what they do and see if they can then be helpful for your business. So thank you all. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Debbie. This was incredible, really deep, wonderful content. So thanks for bringing your expertise to our community. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a great kickoff to summer. Happy June, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next events coming up this summer.
Thanks so much for hosting. Looking forward to meeting the rest of the community.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.